Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. We're not playing our intro music this week, and that is to mark the passing of a very popular and lovely man in Australian cybersecurity, Mr. David Jorm, and we'll be talking a little bit about David towards the end of the news. This week's show is brought to you by Island. They, of course, make an enterprise browser, and Braden Rogers, who works for Island, will be along a little bit later on to talk about the challenge of trying to figure out where all your data is going when it comes to these AI services, right? So you got your chat GPT, sure, you can block that, but what about all of the integrated like AI agents that are springing up everywhere? It's an interesting conversation, and that is coming up after the news with Adam Boileau, which starts now. And Adam, we're going to start with a report from the Sydney Morning Herald by Mr. Andrew Probyn, which is, you know, it's heavy on color, kind of light on details and timeline, but it talks about how ASD apparently did a bit of a search and destroy on some data, some Medibank data being held by Zservers now, or Zservers. This is the Russian bulletproof hosting org that was taken down last week, sanctioned. Looks like there was some, the RMRF shark may have been released and some servers seized in Amsterdam and whatnot, and sanctions imposed against them. But this piece, as I say, it's light on details, but what details there are in there are actually kind of intriguing and give us a little bit of insight into what Australia's Signals Intelligence Agency has been doing to target criminals.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of counter or kind of end to this particular story, because when the original Medibank hack went down, we saw, and we on the show kind of encouraged the response by the Australian government, because a bunch of sensitive medical data belonging to a lot of Australians, something like 10 million Australians, something like that, were taken by ransomware guys, and they had tracked it back to this guy, Alexander Ermakov. But they continued to pull that thread, and now it turns out he was hosting a bunch of data in this organization, Zservers, that is a bulletproof hosting provider, kind of cloud service for crims, and it looks like the Australian spooks figured out who was behind it, or broke into the organization behind it, looked at the various people involved, and that led to some of the sanctions and things that we have seen, or at least we're not quite clear how all of those pieces fit together. But yes, the RMRF shark allegedly got rid of about 0.5 terabyte of Medicare data that was stored on there, and presumably they were pretty confident that that was the place where Ermakov had stored it, as opposed to just kind of one copy of it. And yeah, I guess they had a few terabytes or many terabytes of other people's crime-related things stored there, and bad times all around for the guys that run it.
It's also not clear when this action occurred, whether this was in the lead up to sanctions or in the wake of Medibank. So as I say, it's like heavy on color, light on detail, but the color is good.
Right? The color is good, yes.
Which is that apparently ASD waited until these guys were like heading out. They were based in Siberia apparently, and heading out for like a big party where they were going to all get smashed on vodka, and waited till they were out doing that, and then just like, went a bit wild on their environment, which is the way you want to do it. But look, there's some other details in here that I found fascinating. One of them is that when they were investigating like Ermakov for his role in Medibank, they had linguists and psychologists building profiles on these guys, which I think this is interesting because I don't know if you remember, but when Australia first announced sort of sanctions against Ermakov over his role in the Medibank attack, like a bunch of brainiacs in the CTI space were saying that they got the wrong guy. And you read through this and you're like, no, they got the right guy. And I remember one comment I got from a govie on this is, we know Mr. Ermakov very well, which I guess makes sense when you've got a team of very skilled psychologists actually profiling the guy.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what you expect from an agency like this. Like, they're going to do a serious job. They have serious tasking. They have serious resources. You expect a good quality, well-resourced, thorough job. And you kind of get the impression that that's what they did here. So,
yeah. I mean, I was talking to a CTI pal actually the other day about all of this. And he pointed out that there had been 2 data breaches at Zservers or Zservers last year. And one of them, some data got published that allowed them to actually figure out the IRL identity of some of the admins. And, he wonders, like, was that ASD who did that? And He doesn't know. I mean, these bulletproof hosts have form hacking each other, so it could have just been competition, but it could have been the spooks, and we don't know, and that's great. That's really good. We love this sort of uncertainty, right?
Yeah, exactly. It really goes to the roots of how that crime ecosystem has to work, right? Which is there is a degree of trust and a degree of reputation, and to operate in that world, you have to build trust, build reputation, and when that's undermined, it introduces cost, which is that's what we're all about.
Well, and it's an environment, it's an ecosystem that operates based on rules, many of them unwritten. And what are the rules now? And that's not clear. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So,
and yeah,
good
that's
work,
good.
spooks.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the stuff that we definitely like to see. So we've dropped a link into that one into the show notes. And look, staying with the same story, and Joe Warminski over at The Record has a write-up about the Dutch police's involvement in this. This wasn't just an Australia thing when it comes to the sanctions and whatnot, but they took over something like 127 servers that were in the Netherlands, I think. And it's a bad time to be like one of those guys, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And also, if you were running infrastructure on top of them, like if you were running your cybercrime, you're hacking using their stuff, then you got to expect that all those disks are going to be sifted through and threads pulled, and you're going to have a bad time.
Yeah, and I've linked through to the Australian government defence website where they link these sanctions against Zservers specifically to the Medibank Private hack. So yeah, very interesting. Nice to see it. You love to see it, as we say.
We do.
Now let's have a look at device code phishing. Now, apparently this isn't new, and that makes sense, but it's become a technique that's very popular with Russian APT crews at the moment. And I think, everyone listening to this at some point would have used a device code. It's when you might log into a streaming service or something and that session's expired on your TV and it says, just pull up your browser and enter this device code and that will authorize the device. Obviously, this is phishable, and we got a great write-up here from Dan Gooden over at Ars about how the Russians are using this to access M365 accounts. And I don't know why you would need device-based authentication into an M365 account, but some product manager at Microsoft made this happen, obviously, so you can get your email on your TV or something. But walk us through this one, Adam, because I found this was a great write-up, actually, and just a really interesting phishing technique that I think obviously is gonna work in a lot of places.
Yeah, it is. It's a great write-up. This technique involves, so if you're trying to log into a cloud service, normally these days you're going to be presented with multi-factor authentication flows, maybe with handoff to third-party auth providers in the case of federated authentication. And that whole auth process, because it's so flexible and configurable and there's so many ways of doing it, like the web browser does it for you, but if you are on a device that doesn't have a full-featured modern web browser, then you're kind of in trouble. And so the OAuth standard has some kind of specifications for how to deal with input constrained devices, which is what they call things like TVs and printers and your car and stuff that either doesn't have proper input devices or doesn't have USB ports you can plug a YubiKey into or whatever else, and kind of go through the auth process on two devices. So there's a device that you're trying to authorize, your printer, your TV, or whatever, and then you use a real computer with a real browser to do the normal auth flow and then authorize. And there is like a shared code that you use to kind of bind those two things together. And this phishing process is designed to kind of capture that code by exploiting the confusion about what you're authenticating to. So one of the examples Dan has some screenshots of is someone saying, hey, we'd like you to speak at our conference. We need to arrange some details. Let's get together on a video call and blah, 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 blah. And then they send you an invite that comes from Microsoft to trigger that auth flow. And so then the regular person, like if you don't realize that you're if you're not familiar with that auth flow, you might not consider it to be out of place. And then you provide the code to the attacker in some, whatever context they're phishing you about. And then they use that to get an access token, long-term access token, for onwards connection to your 365 world, which, to your answer your question, like if it's a printer, you can kind of it makes sense that you might want to print documents from the cloud. It needs to be able to, do those kinds of things. So, there are reasons why it exists, but it's, in the end, phishing's got to work. That's the main thing. And this is a technique that works. And clearly we've made the rest of the auth flows so difficult and complicated that they're reduced to this, but hey, it gets the job done. And honestly, I kind of got to hand it to them.
Yeah, I mean, I that was my take here as well, which is like, wow, this is really cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But, it ties back to something that we've been talking about more and more, which is just about how modern authentication flows are just confusing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Because, there's so many parties involved, it's so modular, and things like, when you go through one of those OAuth grants or a flow like this, like it will usually tell you what you're authenticating to, but there are always stupid generic names like Microsoft Trust Center or, things like that. We really, and often there's like a green tick for good luck, why not, or a padlock. And so you really have no, like as an end user, what have you got? What basis do you have to make a good decision? And like even people like you and I, who presumably are experienced at this kind of stuff, like signing into Google's cloud stuff and using their various Google Cloud things and handling all the auth from that and understanding what's an app and what's a, built-in function. It's honestly confusing.
Yeah.
And, I don't know how anyone has any hope to be able to auth safely.
Well, that's a little bit nihilistic, but I guess that's what our listeners have come to expect from us.
Yeah. I mean, we... I compare it to like back in the days when we were telling people to look at the padlocks in their browser bars and check TLS certificates. It's like,
well, I mean, we never told them that, but I know what you mean.
We, the industry, not you and I personally, but, expecting users to make informed decisions about trusting, CAs and certificates was unreasonable, and expecting people to be able to complete these kinds of multi-party federated multi-device auth flows safely, also unreasonable.
And you just think, like, what do you tell one of your mates? Or, a CISO who's got to deal with this,
Yes,
like what's
really
the control?
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about, what's this going to look like in the browser, like in the browser that's being attacked here? Because you're authing to a legit service for a legit thing. You just don't realize that what you're authing to is being then misused for something else. Like you're authing to the real Microsoft. There's no phishing, there's no impersonation of the site. It's all in your head. Yeah. And like, that's not a thing that technical controls are great at. So,
I mean, again, though, I don't understand. I mean, I guess like why are you doing full auth to an M365 account with a device code? Like what? I mean, is that for video conf devices, and why do they need access to everything? I don't know. It just seems like quite often we just roll features without thinking about it, but I guess that's nothing new, right?
And I mean, like underlying it is not one service, right? It's some giant graph API with 1,000 endpoints to get assembled by apps client side into whatever functionality. So you're like a video conferencing app. It's not a video conferencing app. It's a collection of 1,700 raccoons in a trench coat, and every one of those is an auth graph API service or blah, blah, blah. It's complicated, and there's reasons why it's complicated, but that does not make it okay.
No, and look, we're going to move on now to some news that could come from a simpler time. I mean, this stuff, this OAuth extension for device code phishing, you and me, we've been around a while. We're old. It's confusing. It's stressful. It's anxiety inducing. Let's talk about something that's a little bit more old school, which is the Doge.gov website. Where, look, it's not a good sign, right? So why don't we just walk through exactly what's happened here? We're relying on the write-up from Jason Kobler over at 404 Media.
So Doge has a website, doge.gov, and it looks like much of Doge's infrastructure set up in a hurry. And somebody was able to kind of post messages on this site. It's meant to collect stats and social media posts from X that Doge posts. Little simple website, but yeah, turns out there was some kind of like underlying data store that had no auth or something. And yeah, you could just like post your own content onto their website. Great. Good job.
Yeah, it was not difficult to figure this out, I guess is the point. And look, from the very start of this, we've just said the concern for us as sort of cybersecurity people is around data governance. You know what I mean? And if this is sort of happening on their website, you just sort of wonder what's happening in the background. And I think my social media post on this was, this isn't funny. I'm a serious commentator. This is not funny. basically is where I am. Oh, and speaking of social media too, we are now on LinkedIn. So there you go. You can find us if you search for Risky Business Media. We're going to be doing a fair bit on LinkedIn. But Doge website got defaced, essentially. Roll.
Yeah.
Now, this is my favorite story of the week by far. I've been expecting Cloudflare to have issues for years, mostly over the fact that they platform a lot of hate speech and cybercrime stuff. But it's not that got him in trouble in Spain. Adam, walk us through this one.
Oh dear. So, soccer is quite popular, especially in Europe and in Spain.
You mean football, but anyway.
Football, yes, whatever you want to call it. I call it soccer. And there are many sites on the internet which offer pirated versions of, commercial streams of football, soccer games. And some of those are hosted behind Cloudflare or accessed through Cloudflare, or you get the apps to get them through Cloudflare or whatever else. The Spanish Football League went through the courts to demand that Cloudflare block access in this, to this stuff. And the court said, yes, you can get them to block it. And so the net result of all of this is that on the weekends in Spain, when football matches are going on, the local ISPs are being forced to block by IP address bits of Cloudflare's infrastructure so as to stop access to these football games, which of course means that on the weekend, if you wanted to commit some code to GitHub or browse Reddit or, something else that happens to go through that particular bit of Cloudflare, well, tough.
Yeah, so you can't do your code commit on a weekend because of football piracy. It's amazing. I don't know if they actually directly sued Cloudflare or if they sued like local ISPs and demanded that they block them. But, you'd imagine that if the order is from the court, you have to block this stream and it's hosted on Cloudflare. The only thing you can really do is to nuke the CDN, right?
Yeah, I mean, no one comes out of this looking great. And I think the local ISPs have basically said, we're just doing what the court told us to do. And Cloudflare has said a great many things. Net result is,
freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech.
It's always freedom of speech with them, right? Whether it's Nazis or pirated football. What have they actually said about this? I didn't get to that bit.
Basically, they said Cloudflare has repeatedly warned about the consequences of IP blocking that fundamentally ignores the way the internet works, is their argument.
And so that's the way the internet works, is that they do piracy, and that's okay.
Yeah, so they can, I think it's sort of safety in numbers. If you launder, useful services on the same IP address as criminal services, then...
But that works until it doesn't. And that's what I've been saying for years, is eventually there's going to be problems. I just didn't expect it to be football stuff. But, and again, they're using this line. I see the part now in this write-up. While Cloudflare cannot remove content from the internet that it does not host, blah, 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 blah. So they always stick with this line of we're a CDN, we don't host. But it is perfectly within their capability to kick people off their CDN. So it's just a stupid semantic argument, in my view.
Indeed. Yeah. It's, some stuff has to come home to roost with Cloudflare eventually, right? But Spanish soccer, probably not it.
Well, who knows? Maybe this is the first domino, my friend. Let's see if the wicked are punished. Speaking of the wicked, Palo Alto Networks has another firewall vuln under active exploitation. Apparently you can use it with a previous vuln and, just own Panos devices. I mean, it's like we see one of these every week at this point. It's comedy gold. Yeah,
this one is common. This was actually also research out of Asset Note, who were looking into the patch from a previous Palo Alto bug, went and pulled the thread, and it turns out it's the same kind of request smuggling when you've got 17 different HTTP proxies involved in parsing a request, and different ones implement different rules. Then you can kind of thread the needles. I think in this case with URI encoded ... or something like it's IIS from the early 2000s. So that's embarrassing for your security appliances. But yeah, net result is, if you left your Palo Alto web interface on the internet, you're going to get hacked again, presumably. And you have to pay for incident response again, presumably. And yeah, good job with your choice of security appliance.
And congratulations too to the Asset Note team, who the company was acquired actually by a company based out of England. So well done to them. But yeah, just, oh my God. But looks perhaps a more interesting vuln that you don't see very often. And, you know, as soon as I saw that this was a Qualys one, I knew there would be gushing. So I'm getting ready for the gushing.
You're going to let me gush now.
But yeah, the team at Qualys have discovered a couple of bugs in OpenSSH, and one of them's DOS, but the other one, like, it affects non-default configurations, but it's a bug that you would not expect to find in OpenSSH, and kind of a bit concerning. But why don't you walk us through the whole thing here? Because I've been getting questions on this one. You know what I mean? It's one of those, well, you know, what do you know about this SSH bug? So do your thing, Mr. Boileau.
I shall do my thing. So this is a beautiful, wonderful piece of research, as always. I'm going to get the gushing out of the way early.
Gosh. Yeah.
Whoever it is at Qualys that does this was reading some OpenSSH source code and noticed like an idiom that they were using for, you know, a particular, like they're checking a couple of values and then returning from a function, you know, and there's sort of an idiomatic set of code that they use to do that. And the idiom relies on them, you know, getting something right every time. And so the researcher went, well, how many instances in the code base are there of this idiom where they don't do it exactly as they should? And found, you know, they wrote some code QL queries and read some code, and they found, you know, a whole bunch that were not security relevant, but they found one that was. And this was in the process where an SSH client checks the identity of the SSH server. So there's like a host key that it uses to validate that it's the real server. And that particular check, in a certain case, like when you're using host key fingerprints that are sourced out of DNS, if you could make that process run out of memory, then the way it returned its return value was not done correctly, and you could bypass the host identity check. And the net result is, if you're on the network between the client and the server, you can impersonate the server and not get a warning from SSH, which gives you access to, you know, compromise the system. And that's, you know, one of the core guarantees of SSH is that this shouldn't happen, right? It's meant to warn you about this. The other bug you mentioned, which was the denial of service, well, they got to this point where they were like, okay, if we can cause it to run out of memory here, then we can gain access, you know, by bypassing the host validation. Are there any memory leaks? And what they found was a denial of service condition that they can trigger to cause it to run out of memory pre-authentication. And that's the kind of the second bug. So you can use that separately just as a like denial of service, but it's an integral part of actually exploiting the first bug. So both of these have now been patched by the OpenSSH team. But these bugs have been around for a long time, and the necessary configuration was on by default on like FreeBSD for a few years, like by a few years, I mean like a decade. You know, it's unusual that we see bugs like this in OpenSSH because the guys behind it are very good at writing. It's the best piece of C code you're going to see anywhere, in my opinion. So bugs like this are unusual, and of course it's whoever it is at Qualys that does this that would find it, because, you know, instincts on this one were good. Like they spotted something, went, I wonder if, and then next minute, you know, shells. Yeah. So good times.
So if you are running that config, and this the config is something to do with validation via DNS, or what is it?
Host key DNS validation. Yes.
Yeah, host key DNS validation. If that is something that you've got turned on, this could affect you. But I mean, how common is that configuration?
It's not wildly uncommon because managing host key verification in bigger networks is a kind of fiddly, and the other options, which are like certificate trust based or distributing through your configuration management, which is like when I was looking after a bigger fleet of boxes, we did this with the configuration management, but that led to a bootstrapping kind of problem.
Yes.
So doing it in DNS, honestly, is not a terrible idea, especially in a world where DNSSEC exists. But of course, DNSSEC brings you a million other problems. So yeah, I mean, some people could get hacked by this, which is pretty cool.
Well, and they're the people who are trying to do it the right way, right?
Well, yeah.
So, yeah. Now, speaking of further, you know, problems with the technology that underpins our world, Adam, which is what we like to do, we got a great write-up here, actually, from Recorded Future, and they've written an article about it as well, published to the Record. It's on Salt Typhoon's adventures in Cisco devices, but it's funny, right? Because there's two bugs that are exploited here. It looks like they've compromised something like 1,000 Cisco devices, largely at telcos, but some universities and whatnot as well. What's interesting about this is the two bugs that they're using are both termed Privesc. But the first one like allows you to add a user, and this is like termed privesc, which I thought was a bit strange. But yeah, they've rolled up. Well, I don't know that they've rolled it up, but they've identified this campaign that has exploited over 1,000 Cisco devices, a lot of them in the United States. But it's just a really good write-up, and I think it's, you know, for any Salt Typhoon watchers out there, you'll want to get this link.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a read. I mean, these bugs are in iOS XE, which is the kind of Linux underneath variant of iOS, where it's the Linux kernel doing, you know, routing and control, but they give you a user interface that looks like a traditional Cisco iOS.
Yeah.
And these are, you know, in many places, people may not necessarily realize that it's not a like Cisco iOS Cisco device. It's actually a Cisco iOS XE Linux device. And once you've shelled it, like you have all of the power of being able to hide on a real Linux box and do other things. So they're great targets, but they're also not quite as common as, you know, traditional Cisco iOS. But lots of telcos still run them. They're in lots of interesting places. There's quite a product range that run it as well. And I don't know what Cisco's rationale is for which ones are which. But yeah, if you look after a network with iOS XE, you know, it's probably worth having a read to understand what you're up against. Because also, once these guys are in your network, boy, oh boy, you're not going to get them out in a hurry. So
no, and these are CVEs from 2023, but this is the sort of stuff that doesn't get patched, right?
Yes.
Which is why we're seeing it. Funnily enough, you know, this XE stuff that you're talking about, I don't know if it was known by the same name at the time, but something like 15 years ago, some friends of mine found it was like a physical access bug, where if you plugged in via serial and like typed the right command, you would exit the Cisco iOS CLI, and it would just dump you into a Linux shell, and then you could just Trojan the absolute crap out of that box, exit, and the admin, like, it would be invisible to the admin. So not a critical one, given that it required, you know, physical access or whatever, but it was still worth reporting. And they actually hired me like by the hour to handle the bug report off to Cisco. This is back when I used to do this sort of stuff, you know, on the side. And what was really funny was Cisco's response to this was just to EOL that entire line of products. They were just like, because they were already old at that point. They're like, we're not going to patch these. They just slapped EOL, EOL, EOL. They ended like 20 products or something on it because of that report. So that was pretty funny. Moving on, and let's talk about what Sandworm's getting up to. They're going after some Western networks, but they've got some sort of somewhat more interesting C2 happening as part of this campaign, relying on like Tor, right? Which is interesting. And I'm going to talk about why that's interesting after you give us a rundown on what's happened here.
So Microsoft has written up, I guess, an initial access campaign by Sandworm, and it looks like there is a kind of a part of Sandworm that does the initial access and the part that does like the ongoing operations, intelligence gathering, you know, whatever other actions on objectives they have been tasked with doing. So this is the like initial access crowd that have been pretty busy in Ukraine for the last few years, but are now, you know, back out doing things on, you know, on the wider internet a bit more indiscriminately. And Microsoft's analysis says, like, you know, there's lots of targeting going on all around the Western speaking world at the moment from them. They've been at it for a while, and as you say, one of the things that's a bit interesting here is that they are dropping Tor hidden services for command and control on some of these systems, and that's, you know, not at all unheard of, but still kind of interesting.
And not all that difficult to detect, right? No. Like if you were set up for it, not all that difficult to detect. But the reason I find this interesting is you would only do something like this if there's a reason.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I find it interesting. They are obviously doing this for a reason. You know, you don't bother spinning up onion services on an infected host unless maybe you're getting snapped. Using more traditional C2. And for a long time, I've been expecting to see more of this sort of stuff and more of like using social media services for C2 and whatever, more using stuff like TLS 1.3 through CDNs, you know, kind of like a domain fronting style thing. And we just don't see it, right? We just see people just doing the dumbest, most basic C2 ever. And you see something like this and you're like, well, they're doing this for a reason. I wonder what that is. Like, I wonder if it's that their C2s keep getting taken away from them. And you know, that's an efficient way for defenders, like when I'm talking about like nation states here, to just like black hole some C2 IPs or whatever it is, and maybe this is a hedge against that. I don't know what it is, but I guess what I would say is like you don't do this for no reason.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that I also had similar kind of thoughts, because there's always a trade-off when you're going for initial access between kind of size and complexity. Like, we want something that's simple enough that there's very few things to go wrong, because early on in this process, you don't really know the environment you're running in. And so you want to do like minimal amount of stuff, because every extra complexity you add is a chance that things might just go wrong or get snapped or whatever else. And pulling in a whole Tor environment obviously makes a lot of noise on the network. There's been, back when Microsoft used to run like an IPv6 relay network for transition, like when people had V4 didn't have native V6 and Microsoft provided like a Teredo tunneling service, we saw people kind of abusing that because it was minimal lift for you as the attacker to bring in, because all the things you needed were already there on the Windows, but went outside normal stuff, didn't look like normal things on the network, was a great kind of mix of those things. So yeah, having to drag a whole Tor runtime in seems complicated and seems risky, and I guess it means that people are pretty good at spotting stuff on the wire.
Well, but I think the interesting thing for me is that perhaps the concern is less about detection, but more about the fact that if C2 is highly concentrated, it's easy to disrupt. C2 on the open web, you can find those boxes, you can hack them, nuke them, RMRF them, you can talk to the ISP. Like, you've got a lot of options for taking away a lot of access all at once. Whereas with this, okay, sure, each individual victim might be able to detect it, but that's like, is that actually going to happen? Each individual detecting it, and then they've actually got to remediate it. So it's sort of, to me, this seems like sacrificing a little bit of stealth on target to get more of a, result from a macro perspective. That's what I think is going on here.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good analysis. And yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm not crazy. That's
no,
good.
You're not crazy.
Now, we got this terrific piece, absolutely like riot fun piece from Brian Krebs, looking at what Chinese criminals are doing in terms of like essentially phishing credit card holders to add their credit cards to mobile device wallets. And then what they do is they like sell the phones with the actual, with full wallets full of people's credit cards. And like, I think this is a fascinating walkthrough. I mean, the photos are terrific. The whole thing's really interesting. I do wonder though, like, if the banks are doing a sufficiently good job, like this shouldn't happen. You know what I mean? Like, you should be able to detect when someone's trying to spin up a wallet, like when the device is on a different IP and like in a different, like, it just seems like this shouldn't work. And yet it does. And we have this nice write-up from Brian Krebs to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what modern credit card skimming looks like. In the old days, you go to a restaurant, the waiter would, swipe your mag stripe through his recorder and clone your card later. And that's not how, not how it's done these days. This is how it's done. And it's just, also thanks, Brian, for the great write-up. It's really good. So yeah, they send you, so normally the process of enrolling a card for contactless payment on your phone involves your bank sending you some kind of verification code through an existing contact mechanism they have, via text message, via a banking app, whatever you've got. And then these people will, usually in the context of another smaller transaction, so they might run up a fake web store or an auction site or something.
Well, one of the things they're doing here is like sending texts saying you have an unpaid toll, or you have an unpaid, you need to pay a little bit to the post office to release this thing, and that's how they're setting up these transactions. And then as part of that flow, they say, well, we're going to send a code to your banking app, just give us that code, and then that's how they're enrolling the cards in Apple Wallet. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's Apple, but mobile device wallets.
Yeah, in mobile device wallets, both Apple and Google. And then, it totally makes sense. That's another example of people being confused about the context of authentication, which is very similar to the device code phishing thing we talked about earlier on. And then, load up the phones with, a few dozen payment cards and then sell them, which is smart. They're also providing a service where you run an app on your Android phone, which real-time relays the payment through one of their phones that's got the wallet, got the full wallet. So you don't have to get the physical device from China, you can just install an app on your phone, go up to a payment terminal in your regular country, and then it will relay it in real time to the other phone in China, play it out to the payment terminal, and voila, you've paid your stuff. And there's actually a picture that Krebs has got here of some guys being arrested in Singapore at like an Apple store or something, doing exactly that. So yeah, I mean, clearly people are doing it. And the fact that it works so well, I think, you were bang on. Like, it's interesting that the banks and the phone manufacturers, like, they're the ones that are in a position to detect this from an like anomalous pattern of use point of view. And as this gets bigger, obviously that will become more of a focus for them, because it does, this should be unusual.
Yeah, and you would just think most of the banks should have an app presence on devices where they're rolling, like where they're trying to enroll these sort of cards. And there's so much you could do here. And I think to a degree, like for at least the big banks, I think they'll probably be able to tackle this. But it's going to take time and effort, which is why we are where we are.
Yeah, and anything that requires individual banks to do stuff is going to take a while, right? Because there's a whole range of banks with different ranges of maturity, and it would be nicer if there was a Google and Apple end approach that could kind of hobble this right at the at that endpoint.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that those phishing messages or smishing messages are actually going out through iMessage and, in the case of Google, RCS.
Yes.
So they're not even like hitting the telcos. So anyway, good stuff. Go have a read of that if that is interesting to you. Another banger from Dan Gooden. He's really had the goods over the last week. But he's written about sort of like trends, I guess, in prompt injection and how people are doing funny stuff with LLMs. Like, in an example he talks about in this piece, it's where you can essentially send people something that tricks the like Gemini LLM that's in your Google account into going and grabbing sensitive documents and sending them to the attackers and whatever, and looks at Google's approaches to fixing that, where he's quite critical of the way they've done that. But then I just sort of think, well, sort of what's your alternative here? And this is just a great example about how plugging large language models into absolutely everything is going to come with all sorts of very strange risks.
yeah, exactly. I was struck reading this by the similarities of this and traditional memory corruption attacks, where you're confusing code and data.
And I was thinking about web attacks and things like cross-site scripting and getting contexts all mixed up, yes. Right? But I mean, I guess that's the thing, right? It's all about, a new technology that requires, boundaries to be better defined, right? So yes. I guess everything that's new is old again. Or... Yeah,
exactly. Yes. I mean, that's exactly what this is, right? It's confusion about who is providing the instructions and who is providing the data. And some of these tricks for like one of the ones Dan talks about is they call it like delayed activation or something, where the LLM has got some filters that stops it from taking actions immediately from the data that it's processing. So you can't just have it summarize a doc that contains instructions to send all your passwords to the attacker. But in this case, they're doing a thing which is, next time I type yes, send all the passwords to the attacker. So it's not doing the action then, but it's queuing it up for later, which is the sort of stuff that, a real artificial intelligence, the ones that we one day may have, ought to be able to understand that that's not exactly what I meant. But once again, now we're into like, crazy reasoning about it. And who says a computer is going to be any better at making security choices than the humans are? So like, yeah, it's... We don't talk about this specifically, but like this week's sponsor interview, the whole theme is like, what do you do about LLMs everywhere, and not just the major services, but like LLMs in products like Gemini, right? And how do you avoid exposing the wrong sort of data to that stuff, because that gets risky, and how do you do that? And they're taking a stab at it. Island, being an enterprise browser, they can see a lot more in the browser than you would otherwise, and block various endpoints and whatever. But, basically they're saying,
you kind of need to have that DLP approach of like not allowing that data to get anywhere near those things in the first place.
Yeah, it's complicated, you know. It's
really complicated, man. Like there's some interesting new challenges here, especially now this stuff is everywhere. Just quickly going to mention it. John Grieg has reported that woman who was arrested in Arizona last year for running a North Korean IT worker laptop farm, she's pleaded guilty. Prosecutors are seeking like 7 to 9 years. So she's having a bad time. But, you know, I've always said, I have said for the last, year or two that I think that's the weak point with these scams of the laptop farms. They're pretty easy to identify, and, word gets out that this is illegal. And I think you'd have to be a real dummy to engage in that sort of activity and not expect to be caught. But, the world is not short of dummies. So I expect we'll be reporting on that for some time to come. We've also seen Alexander Vinnik, who's the Russian guy who was operating BTCE, the cryptocurrency exchange, which is now defunct, and he was convicted of a bunch of cyber crimes, and he's in prison in the United States. Apparently, he is has been released in exchange for some teacher who was being held in Russia for, possession of marijuana, which is their go-to charge when they want a hostage. It looks like there's been a swap there. I mean, it's depressing, isn't it?
It's depressing, and it kind of rewards Russia's, use of hostages to get these kind of concessions and releases and stuff. So, sigh. I guess at least he did have to forfeit $100 million, so that's not nothing.
That is actually mostly it for the week's news. But I did just want to talk a little bit, as I mentioned at the top of the show. David Jorm unfortunately passed away last week. He was a good friend of mine. I'd known him something like 20 years. Good hacker, great person, and I'm definitely going to miss him. But I did just want to. I spoke with his parents last night, right? And they've agreed that I can disclose a little bit of detail about how he died, basically, because there's a little bit of confusion out there, and understandably, because the posts sort of announcing his death were somewhat vague and linked off to a mental health charity. Look, as best as everyone understands, this wasn't a case of suicide. Dave did suffer from bipolar disorder and could become very sick occasionally, right? So I knew him quite well, and he would be fine most of the time, but then he would get on a massive manic upswing and then a crash afterwards. And this is something that he'd been living with for quite a long time, and it did complicate his life somewhat, but he knew how to manage it. He got better at managing it, right? And an example of that is like last week when he felt himself going manic, he actually called in sick, because he had previously not done that, and that had caused him problems at work. At his previous work at the bank, I won't name the bank, they had to deal with some of that when he would go a little bit off tilt, and they were very good. He always really appreciated the way that they handled all of that. So I think it's important. Some of them would be listening to this and they would know. And indeed, I spoke to his parents last night, as I mentioned, and they went and visited his office at one point when he was off sick, and saw his desk. I think they had to go and get something from the office for him, and saw all of the messages and gifts that people had left for him. And, he was definitely supported there and certainly appreciated it. But it does look like what happened is sometimes when Dave would be on one of these upswings, he would drink as a way to calm the sort of manic anxiety that he would experience. And it looks like perhaps he just drank too much, and that may have suppressed his breathing while he was asleep, but it certainly just looks like he passed in his sleep. And I went back and forth with his folks last night about what to say, because if you say it was misadventure, as his dad says, like that makes it sound like he thought he grew wings and jumped out a bloody window, and if you just say it was mental health related, people will assume it was suicide. So I just wanted to clear that up for people who knew him, because so many people knew him in Australia. He's a hacker who's been hacking since the 90s, was a hacker who'd been hacking since the 90s, and just, always fun to be around, terrific guy, wicked smart. And, he organised the TUSCON conference, which was the one in a caravan park in Queensland, where it was basically just 40 people camping somewhere nice. He presented at KiwiCon. He was on the show talking about some of his research into North Korea. He spoke about Red Star OS at KiwiCon while using his alter ego, which was a stuffed toy called Lord Tuskington, the walrus, which was up on the lectern. And I think he was down there with a microphone. You knew Dave. You weren't as close to him as I was, but, he's definitely going to be missed.
Yeah, he really is. I carried Lord Tuskington, the walrus, the stuffed walrus. I carried him out on like a decorative pillow for that presentation and put him on the lectern and positioned the microphone in front of the walrus while David voiced the walrus in a husky sort of faux English accent from offstage. And it was just, it was a wonderful piece of InfoSec comedy, doing amazing research, but also presenting it in a way that's engaging and memorable and fun. And that's kind of who he was, It's very sad that he has left us.
Yeah, it is. And led an amazing life. And indeed, speaking to his mum last night, the thing that they're taking comfort in is just how much he lived his life on his own terms. He was an avid outdoor adventurer. I once told him about a coastal walk through a national park here that's like 100-kilometer long multi-day walk. And within a few months, he'd just done it. So he would go on these epic multi-day bushwalks. He was an SES volunteer as well for the State Emergency Service. He was actually a devout Hare Krishna as well, which a lot of people wouldn't know. He had been for decades. But that was something he was quite guarded about until more recent years, when he's like, no, this is okay. This is a part of myself that I can share. And, my condolences to everybody else who knew him. I mean, another great example of Dave is he volunteered to work in an election one year just because he wanted to see how elections would work and like what the security situation is like with elections. And as it turns out, according to him, pretty good. You'd need multiple people at multiple different levels of an election to try to alter an account and whatnot. He was also a great friend to me when my family went through its own health crisis many years ago. Just a wonderful guy. And we're really going to miss him. What more do you say?
Yeah, exactly.
And I believe also he was afflicted by the same disease as you when it came to Java applications.
Yes, there are very few people who were willing to, punch Java right in its jar files quite as much as I enjoy it, and he was absolutely one of them. So we had that in common, and we shared some good bugs over the years.
Yeah, lived around Australia. He would stay in a place for a while and could say, okay, I've done that, on to the next place, on to the next place, on to the next place. And, his skills development was the same. Like, this is a guy who just, couldn't stop learning. And again, okay, I'm ranting now. This one's hurt. I gotta be honest. It's really hurt. And I think a lot of people are feeling that at the moment. Okay, so let's wrap it up there, Adam. Thank you so much for discussing the week's news with me, and we'll do it all again next week.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pat. I will see you next week.
That was Adam Boileau there with a check of the week's security news. It's time for this week's sponsor interview now with Braden Rogers, who is the Chief Customer Officer at Island, the browser maker, and you can find them at island.io. And they're fully featured enterprise browser with all sorts of very, very interesting features and use cases. And one thing they've been spending a bit of time on lately is looking at just how much company data can wind up being exposed to large language models, and not just through people spinning up their own private ChatGPT accounts and pasting stuff into it, but as we were just talking about in the news, like if you're a Google user or a Microsoft user, there's LLMs everywhere now. And so Braden joined me to talk about, this issue and what people can do about it. Here he is.
There's the obvious destinations that are generative AI, and we make decisions about whether we decide to block those, or we allow them, or we put them through potential workflows. And the workflow could be, maybe we let a user make a request for an approval natively in the user experience, and then that approval flows through the organization, and an appropriate business level approver makes the decision to allow it and understands the risk. And what we do in that particular case, we might put that in a place where the user can access it, but keep it outside the boundary of the corporate app. So one of the foundational things that we think a lot about is how do we deal with unstructured data scenarios? And I think this is one of the biggest challenges. Back to your comment you just made, even I saw the eyebrows raised there. The old school approaches of DLP. The challenge with DLP feels like a bit of a washing machine. And I've been working with it for 20 years. It feels like a bit of a washing machine stuck on spin cycle, because the way you deal with the challenge around your data is you start with tactical pieces of data. And let's say you just build your taxonomy that you're looking for, and you build kind of your lexicon that you're identifying content with. The problem is you struggle with that with structured data, much less unstructured data. So what happens now with the world of AI, you get this whole issue around derivative forms of data. So now think about it. The AI can fling out versions of my data that they're semantically different, they look different, but they say the same thing, and they're certainly not conforming to my DLP structures that I created before. So one of the things we're really focused on is thinking about how do we tackle non-structured data or non-structured data in non-traditional ways. And big part of that for the obvious stuff is, well, here's my corporate applications, and here's the things outside of those boundaries. So don't let corporate data spill to those things outside of those boundaries. Let the user freely use ChatGPT or whatever the obvious thing on the outside is that's personal, but don't let the user just copy beyond the boundary.
Yeah, really so that'd be like a copy-paste restriction solves some of this, like out the gate, right? Because they just can't do that copy-paste.
Correct. It could be file movement in the same way. Again, the boundary is a unique construct. Now, within that, I think one of the things that we think a lot about is there's obvious areas of sensitivity in applications that are where unstructured data exists. I'll use a perfect example. Think about EMR environments, electronic medical records. Physicians don't type their patient notes to conform, again, back to your structure of your data protection technologies. They write them in the way they want to write them. And that unstructured language is a very difficult thing for old school DLP to tackle. So we might do something like in that particular case, redact the fields of a form and govern how people have accessibility to the fields in the form. And when someone unredacts that data, don't let that specific set of objects be moved over to the application that's in question here, this generative AI technology or whatever outside the boundary. So the boundaries and kind of the governance of the presentation layer give us some ability to handle unstructured data in very unique ways. Now, back to your comment a moment ago, we can combine those things with DLP as well. And it's not like DLP is dead. Orgs have made years of investment in that. And what we want to do is use it effectively. So used in the context of those boundaries, I don't have to worry about my data flowing to the wrong places. So now I apply DLP much more selectively within the boundary and maybe even outside of it a bit. But tying into the investment somebody's got, if they've been investing in Microsoft information protection for years or a semantic DLP or something they've spent 15, 20 years investing in, tying into that and leveraging that, but not throwing it all away right out of the gate can be important for the places where you're just not sure. So this field, what's backing this field? Is this field got AI behind the scenes and we don't know it? And it's an application we don't know much about. Maybe I'll just govern with my traditional DLP approaches there. But again, the boundaries change the game a bit.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the next question, right? You're talking about, like, from first principles, just restricting the way that people can move stuff around, which is going to naturally limit their ability to, like, just paste whatever, copy and paste into ChatGPT, whereas they can copy and paste between corporate apps and whatnot. So, that all makes sense. But what about when it comes to all of these large language models that are popping up in existing services? And they might be personal accounts, they might be corporate accounts, but the point is, it's data you don't necessarily want to expose to, you don't want it becoming part of someone's training set. How do you then go about trying to deal with that? Because I imagine, that's nigh on impossible.
Yeah, it's within the boundary, you've accepted that you understand those apps and you've adopted their standard corporate apps. Like, so for example, let's use an example of G Suite. As Google introduces AI directly in the interfaces of their apps, you're making an analysis of the apps and saying, hey, I'm going to accept that the model's now part of their universe as an application provider. So you deal with those accordingly. And then obviously, as I mentioned a moment ago, you may apply, some DLP policies within that. Again, maybe the old school vehicles, again, because of the fact that it's living in the boundary. But at the end of the day, some of that you're bound by a bit, because at the end of the day, when they get your data, you've got an understanding of how their models work. If their models train the other things in their environment as well, they're not isolated in your world. There's not an obvious way to understand that unless you have a relationship and understand your vendors and you've done due diligence and understand how they use the models. For the things outside of that, again, it goes back to those constructs I mentioned a moment ago. Sometimes generative AI objects in the applications are obvious, and those are things we can easily identify because we see object level items, in the DOM of the applications and things along those lines. So we might govern those a little more tightly, and sometimes they're not so obvious. And again, the data is still the data nonetheless at the end of the day. Whether it's going into a generative AI model in the back end or it's going into somebody's database on the back end, you still don't want the data to flow to the wrong place.
Yeah, so really, I guess what you're saying here is that ultimately the thing you want to do is just put some boundaries around stuff you don't want going into LLMs.
Yeah.
and don't let it go anywhere it's not supposed to go.
Yeah. I think it's true. And I think the challenge is for this isn't going to work like, shadow IT would did before. Wake up calls coming for everybody. And I mentioned earlier that the competitive advantage, the pressure that you feel as an executive in an org when you see your competitor adopting it, we're going to have to think of ways to empower people to say yes to things that otherwise we might not have said yes to in the past. We learned how to say yes to things like visitors in our office and our employees roaming and getting on foreign networks and Wi-Fi networks all over the place. And we just have to figure out a way to say yes. And again, with the browser being the center of how the user engages, the most of it seems like an obvious place to be able to find the creative ways to say yes.
Now, speaking of, I want to just change topics, if that's okay with you, because one thing I found myself wondering about is, if you could give us a bit of insight into what the maintenance of something like Island looks like, right? Because you are maintaining, essentially like a Chrome fork, Chromium fork. And, how big does your maintenance team that is just responsible for writing and distributing patches, like how, just talk to us a little bit about how all that works, because I imagine that is a lot of what you do, right? So there's all of the features and the DLP and the whiz bang stuff, but I imagine like a big part of the business is just keeping this thing running, stable, patched, up to date. Yeah, give us some insight there.
Fortunately for the Chromium side of the fence, being a part of the ecosystem, we get the inherent advantages of being part of the contributing community as well. So we see a lot of these things early, and we inherit those things as they make it to the ecosystem, both good and bad sometimes. But obviously, we put a lot of effort into making sure that we provide facilities for the org from a change management standpoint, the ability to make decisions about when they take the new things on. Very much like the Chromium ecosystem, we separate new feature capabilities from security patches or security updates, so you can make decisions. And, God forbid that like some of the incidents we've seen over the past year let you ring fence things, make you policy decisions. Maybe I don't want to take new features as an end customer. I don't want to take new features during the Christmas holiday shopping season if I'm a retailer. Maybe I'll take a 0-day update if I need to. But be able to segment those out. And then again, obviously ring fence your audiences. Maybe I don't take those in the stores, but I take those in this part of the business anytime that I need to. So again, the contextual clarity or contextual awareness that it uses to be able to identify circumstantial situations where we should and shouldn't do these things is important. For us, the reality is everything we do on top of that is like any other software company. It's building capabilities, and we just happen to be building on top of Chromium. So we set our teams up in what we call islands, obviously, and there's islands for different types of situational things. We have data protection island. Internally, we have a team of folks doing that. We have user experience island, and they all kind of run as their own separate business inside the company. They work very closely in alignment, but they're all trying to drive for some of them slightly different outcomes, user experience, but then they start coming together where maybe I need data protection to communicate something to the user slightly different than they had before. So those two teams come together to work. Because
I just would have thought like, some Chromium updates might break an island feature that you've implemented, right? And like, I guess I was just more asking what what sort of scale the sort of, maintenance and QR teams are. Do you have like just a specific team that is dedicated to like the core Chromium stuff and figuring out like, well, we can just merge this in like right away, or this might break something, or, what does that sort of testing, QA and maintenance process look like?
Yeah, fortunately, in today's climate, automating all these things is your friend. So a substantial amount of automation takes care of the human side of the house. In that as well. The great thing about the way Chromium launches, and obviously the way we work with it with Island, we follow that Chromium launch train. We see code early on. So we begin our builds early on in the process around things like the Canary builds of Chromium. So Canary's early adopter stuff that most people in the world never see much about. And, we continue our build process through beta. And in that process, before we release, we even have early adopter customers in different segments as well that take these things on. So we're not likely to really break something in a large scale production environment because we see stuff so early in the process. And it doesn't take a lot of, honestly, our team's not very large that has to do these things because the automation frameworks that are available now for handling many of these things are made much easier. But certainly we have people that spend their time focused on this to make sure that, on the other end of this is a resilient environment that keeps the customer safe at the same time, doesn't break things.
So I imagine you're doing like dog fooding your own betas, for example.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Obviously we, everybody internally, we're the earliest of adopters of the technology. So as we build something new into things like beta cycles, et cetera, we're all consuming it internally ourselves. But we've also got customers that they believe and they want to understand early code. Some people have staging environments, and obviously I mentioned the ring fencing. This allows some orgs to take on earlier code, ring fence some of that code off from people. And so earlier groups can get stuff without.
So you got like ring deployments, and customers want to do that as well because they want to make sure. Because I'd imagine too that everybody's going to have their own use for this thing. So it is theoretically possible you could push an update that will be fine for 99.9% of people and might break something over here. So is that why people are doing that? Is just to really make sure for their use case that everything's going to go without a hitch?
Yeah, sure. I mean, think about, I think you probably talked about this ad nauseum on the show, but there's been a lot of learnings over the past year. And
CrowdStrike.
Honestly,
We're talking to CrowdStrike.
Yeah. And obviously things before. I mean, we've seen things go up in the night across the board. That is the purpose of, setting things up in a structured way where we don't just thrust everything upon everybody all at once. And in our world, it may be days before, the first group gets something 4 or 5 days earlier than the next group, or months. Some orgs will take a change freeze for something for a period of time that there's just no tolerance for risk in that environment from a resiliency standpoint. So built a lot of facilities, put a lot of thinking into that, and put a lot of thinking into things like external services that we could be dependent on that could cause issues as well, so that we have resiliency around those. Because, like, for example, your single sign-on provider, a lot of the world's dependent on that. When they have a bump in the night, suddenly people can't do work. So, thinking of things of external dependencies where people can still do work, even when some external service provider may be having an issue.
All right, Braden Rogers, thank you so much for joining us on the show to walk us through some island stuff. Always great to see you. Thank you.
You as well, Patrick.
That was Braden Rogers from Island there. Big thanks to him for that. And again, you can find Island at island.io. But that's it for this week's show. I do hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you next time.